Okay, so what you're looking at right now is probably going to feel a little familiar to a lot of you, even if you've never actually played this game before. And there's a good reason for that. Both System Shock and the first two Elder Scrolls games, Arena and Daggerfall, owe their existence to today's ancient DOS game, Ultima Underworld. In fact, this game was made by the same developers who made System Shock, using a precursor to the engine which powered that game. So the similarities there are no surprise. But Arena was directly inspired by this game, and Daggerfall was more or less a massive update over Arena while still keeping a lot of the same mechanics. So given that these games all owe their existence in some way to Ultima Underworld, how does this original game fare? Actually, surprisingly well. Given the age of this game and the fully texture mapped 3D environment, I was kinda expecting something way more dodgy, way more finicky, and way more unforgiving. And while the game does have some quirks which you need to get used to if you tend to get very far, it's nothing that can't be adapted to. In fact, for as linear as the game is, lacking any sort of procedural generation of any kind, I was kind of surprised by how freeform it is. The game gives you all the tools and capabilities you need to roleplay your way through this however you want to, while at the same time giving you an overarching goal you're free to pursue in whatever way you please. You can take the peaceful approach, only fighting the things which want you dead and not stealing from any of the locals. You can take sides, playing nice to certain inhabitants while slaughtering your way through the others. Or you can literally take the approach of kill everything that moves and still potentially reach a conclusion of some sort. At least I'm assuming it works out that way, just judging by how the game was playing as far as I got. This game's massive, so naturally I've only played a fraction of it, but that's still enough to give a general overview of what to expect and how to deal with the game's many oddities. Ultima Underworld was originally developed by Blue Sky Productions and published by Origin Systems in 1992. Now, I know I said this game and System Shock were made by the same developers, and that's because Blue Sky Productions became Looking Glass Technologies after a merger not long after making both Ultima Underworld games. As far as its genre, I'd consider it a one-player action RPG, given the reliance on stat numbers and leveling combined with the real-time gameplay. It only supports VGA 320 by 256 color graphics, while including audio support for the AdLib, PC Speaker, Roland MT32, and Sound Blaster sound devices. As for its current release date, it's still commercial but easily obtainable from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com for $6 as a package of both the original game and the sequel. But if you want a physical copy, you'd better be prepared to shell out for it. Even though Ultima Underworld is a common game, you can find complete in-box copies easily, the prices are way up there, with the average sale price being anywhere between $60 and $150, depending on condition or if any pieces are missing. Heck, even with loose copies where you're only getting the discs, you can still end up paying $30 to $40. And by the way, this applies to both the original game and the sequel. Even some of the alternate releases, like the combo box including both Ultima Underworld games, sells for a bunch, though there are some exceptions. For instance, there's a particular gold box release which seems to be more reasonably priced, but it doesn't include any of the numerous extras originally included with these games, which does kind of explain why it's cheaper. Basically, if you just want to play this game and aren't trying to build a collection of physical media, stick with the GOG release. The physical copies are just far too collectible despite how easy they are to find.
Now speak truth or falsehood, I cannot say.
So as is common with the Ultima games, the story transcends its genre to some degree, being somewhat atypical for a fantasy adventure. Plus the backstory is massive, so for sake of time, I'm just going to get straight to the point. You play the role of a character known simply as the Avatar, someone destined to attend various lands in times of peril. You begin the game having a strange dream where a wizard known as Garamon begs your assistance. Now you agree and are then whisked away for real to a land known as Britannia, where you arrive in the bedchamber of the local baron's daughter Ariel just after she had been kidnapped by a minion being controlled by an evil wizard known as Tybal. Well, I say evil, but when you look into the breadth of the game's backstory, it turns out that Garamon and Tybal are actually brothers, but Tybal betrayed his brother in exchange for ultimate power during a particular event. Suffice to say, with the Baron's daughter being carried off into the woods, the guards end up storming the chamber and presume you had something to do with it. After being dragged before the Baron, he seems willing to pardon you of the crime, on the condition that you return his daughter to him. The only catch is that Ariel was being dragged off to a place known as the Stygian Abyss. Now, this underground realm, sealed off from the outside world, was initially a utopian attempt to unite the many races of the world, but it's long since fallen into disarray, and while many of the races are not immediately hostile towards you, seeing as you're new to the Abyss, many of them are hostile towards each other. In any case, as you're cast inside, the guard tells you that the door will forever remain closed, unless and until he can hear Ariel's voice from the other side. You thus start the game immediately following these events, with nothing on your person save for some basic clothing, with the singular goal of rescuing Ariel and returning to the same door to be released. Before you begin the game, you have to create your character, and there are quite a lot of possibilities here as to how your character can be crafted. You first select your gender and handedness, which don't really have an effect on the gameplay, but then you select a class from 8 selections. Now, something I need to point out right now is that Ultima Underworld does not have a typical progression system. Now, you do gain experience points and experience levels, but the way you progress your character and gain skills has a level of random chance to it, yet also some level of control as to how those random skills are distributed. So basically, no matter which class you pick, in the long run, they're not really much different from each other. So this initial selection is more so to set yourself up for the early game by determining your starting stats and skills. After selecting your class, you then get to choose 2 skills to apply bonus points to, starting with a skill related to the class you chose, followed by a weapon proficiency skill. Now, beyond attacking with your fists, there's 4 kinds of weapons: swords, axes, maces, and missile weapons, with swords being the fastest to swing with the lowest damage, and maces being the slowest to swing with the highest damage. You then choose your character portrait and the game's difficulty level between settings of standard and easy. The easy setting simply makes any enemies you face less of a threat, having less hit points and doing less damage with their attacks. You then name your character and enter the dungeons. Now, the first thing you're going to notice about how the game controls is that it's actually very straightforward and similar to more modern games. A and D turn you left and right, Z and C strafe side to side, S is to walk forward, W is to run forward, and X has you step backwards. However, to jump, you use the J key, which doesn't come up often, but I'm going to talk more about it a bit later. And to look up and down, you use 1 to look down, 3 to look up, and 2 to reset your view. It's also important to note that the walls may render a bit wonky. This is actually one of the earliest examples of texture mapping on 3D polygon objects in a game, so the perspective mapping isn't 100% perfect, especially when looking up or down. In fact, correcting for perspective issues is quite the drain on CPU power and could kill the frame rate in some of the earliest 3D texture map games to support it. And the only reason it's not a factor in games like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom is because the environments are not actually 3D polygons, so various shortcuts can be taken to do the texturing fast and accurately. Another thing I should point out right away is that I'm playing the game modded to make the 3D rendered area brighter. Without modding, this is a very dark game, even with the light sources equipped and burning as bright as they can. And combined with modern video compression, this would have made the game extremely difficult to see for all of you, so I made the decision to mod it so that it'd be easier to see what was going on. The mod is simple, it's just an adjustment to a palette file, which I downloaded from a link on the page for this game on the PC Gaming Wiki website. I'll include a link to it in the video description for anyone else who wants to use this mod. Something else I need to point out too is that the game doesn't hold your hand at all, and without the manual, you're probably gonna have a bad time. For starters, it probably looks like you only have 12 inventory slots, 4 equip slots, which you can also hold random items in, as well as 8 slots for whatever you want. In actuality, you're allowed to pick up the container objects you find, such as boxes and bags, and you can then use those containers to store even more items, limited only by a remaining weight limit listed at the side there. The manual also instructs you as to picking up both the map and the rune bag. Now, it's possible to beat the game without these 2 items, but you gotta be some kind of masochist to want to avoid them. The map is crucial to your survival, as this is a very big dungeon that's very easy to get lost in, not to mention the map supports writing notes anywhere on it. You're absolutely going to want to take advantage of this to mark out important locations or other important things. The other important item to grab is the rune bag. The way you cast magic in this game is through combining pairs or triples of runes together, and without this bag, you'd have to carry each rune in other parts of your inventory, whereas the bag gives you convenient access to all of them. Now, if you're avoiding magic entirely, you could skip the rune bag and all the runes, but virtually every character class has some level of magical proficiency, and you can even acquire that proficiency anytime you want, so avoiding all magic is kind of a dumb thing to do. Casting spells can be a trip and a half though. Now, first, there's a lot of spells, so memorizing them all is pretty much out of the question. Next, you need the correct runes to cast them. Next, every spell belongs to a particular circle. Spells of the first circle cost 3 mana to cast, with each spell circle higher being 3 more than the last per spell cast. And to even cast spells in a particular circle, your experience level has to be at least twice as high, rounded down. So to cast a third circle spell requires you to reach a minimum experience level of 5, and it'll burn 9 mana when you do. Suffice to say, keep the spell section of the manual handy when playing this game, because you're going to be looking stuff up in it frequently. Though you can always keep one set of runes ready for casting at all times. I ultimately found keeping my healing magic handy was the most useful thing to do for my paladin. So, as I already alluded to, there's a lot of denizens of this realm. The first people you meet are all falsely accused prisoners, just like yourself, making it through life as best as they can. Now, this is where you'll find out that you can actually barter with a lot of individuals. When you choose to barter, they'll offer you a particular selection of goods, which you can then decide if you want to trade for it at all. Now, since weapons, armor, and just many items in general can be in various states, right-clicking on each of them to see what their states are is probably a good idea before you decide to offer anything in return. You also use these barter slots for giving gifts to characters who ask for them. Now, speaking of the dialogue, these dialogue trees are pretty intricate for an early 90s game, and sometimes it's not altogether obvious which choices you should pick, as many of the characters you meet have unusual behaviors, or may take offense from things that you wouldn't think would be offensive, or require you to pander to them in various ways. And this is more common with the more important people you meet, so the regular folks you meet will often give you advice for dealing with the more prominent leaders and such. Now, getting back to the gameplay, let's talk about combat, because even though it feels finicky, it's really not, provided you ignore the manual to some extent. And so here's the thing. The way you perform melee attacks, or even ranged attacks, is by holding the mouse button down while in combat mode to charge up your attack. The gem at the right side of the screen starts red, then goes amber, then green. Letting go of the attack button while the gem is still red cancels the attack. Letting go while it's amber unleashes a weak attack, while waiting for green will give you an attack of the proper strength. Now, your proficiency with the weapon you're using determines whether or not your attack will actually find its mark and do any damage. Melee weapons can also have one of 3 types of attacks performed: thrusting, slashing, or bashing, depending on which third of the 3D viewport your mouse cursor is in when you start charging the attack, with each weapon type working better or worse with certain kinds of attacks. But on top of all of that is the one thing the manual actually gets wrong. It says that when you're ready to strike with your charged attack, you need to move the mouse cursor over what you want to hit and release the mouse button. What you actually need to do is just get really close and just release the mouse button. So long as what you want to hit is in the middle of the screen and at point-blank range when using anything other than a missile weapon, the success chance will be rolled. This is pertinent because it's very easy to attempt an attack and think you're in range when you're really not. One thing that's very cool though is that there's a subtle way to track the hit points of your target. Anytime one of your attacks hits, the eyes of the gargoyle at the top of the border for the 3D view will light up. If they light up green, the enemy still has most of their health left following your attack. Amber means they're around half health, give or take some hit points, while red means you either killed the target or they're approaching death. You can gauge how well you're doing by tracking what color eyes you see with each successful attack. For instance, if you immediately get amber eyes on your first attack, your target won't survive another hit or two. Yet, if you get green eyes for 3 attacks in a row, it's probably going to take many more attacks to take out your target. Don't worry if you die though, for death is not permanent. Usually. Actually, the respawning mechanic for the player in this game is very interesting. Now, early on in the first settlement you come across, you'll find a silver sapling. Now once you touch the silver sapling for your first time, it'll forever be bound to your fate, as it transforms into a simple seed. Now in certain areas where the soil is untouched by the scars of battle or masonry, you can plant the seed and a new silver sapling will grow in an instant. Now if you die at any point, anywhere in the dungeon, you respawn wherever you planted the sapling. However, if you die while carrying the seed or without it properly planted, then the game is over. Thus, anytime you want to advance where your respawn point is to be closer to where you're exploring, you're kind of taking a chance at being killed without a chance for respawning. Though since everything that happens in this dungeon is permanent, such as defeating enemies, the best method to take is to just clear a safe path to a spot that looks good for planting the sapling, then go back, get it, and take it to the spot that you found. It's important to note too that not everything is dangerous. Heck, the very first rat you come across is not hostile. When you put your mouse over it and look at it with the look command, you'll see that it's simply upset, not hostile. Said rat though is keeping a stash of food, and taking that food will absolutely make the rat want to kill you. So that's just something to keep in mind here, is that even monsters can be seemingly harmless, but also worth experience and stuff, so it really just ties into how freeform this game lets you be. Speaking of, let's talk about where the freeform nature of the game ends, and that's advancement. So, advancing in experience levels doesn't actually do anything to your stats, other than your hit points, which will go up slightly. Instead, gaining experience makes you able to chant mantras at various altars you come across to power up randomly chosen stats and skills. Now, unless there's more later in the game that I didn't find, there's 3 mantras specifically. One for courage, one for mystery, and one for love. The courage mantra increases stats and skills related to combat, the mystery mantra increases stats and skills related to magic, while the love mantra increases the more miscellaneous skills, which don't relate specifically to combat or magic, such as your ability to swim or repair worn equipment using an anvil. Now, even though you can choose which mantras to chant, you can't choose what random skill points you get. This can lead to some frustration during advancement. For instance, I decided to start my paladin off with sword skills, yet despite numerous advancements towards combat, I only ever got like a single extra point in my sword skill, and numerous points into my unarmed skill. So many, in fact, that my unarmed skill nearly exceeded my sword skill at one point. So when my only sword broke, I just took my fists out and started beating up my adversaries that way. Which actually ended up working surprisingly well, even if it was kind of slow. The point, though, is that even if you have an idea of how you want to play your character, the game is going to have its own mindset, and you need to adapt to that, or you're just going to end up angry and dead. And speaking of ending up angry, let's talk about the jumping. So, there's actually some platforming in this game, believe it or not, and this aspect of the game wasn't really tested very well. The first problem is that when you hit anything solid in midair, even if it's just the tips of your toes, your whole body bounces backwards with the same force you had going forwards. This means if you overshoot a jump thinking the wall on the other side will save you, nah, you're gonna be sent flying backwards and likely down whatever pit was in your way. This can also make climbing up from little spots where only the tiniest jump is needed very tedious, as you have to do it from an extreme angle to have enough room to clear the ledge in front of you, given that the minimum forward speed is actually a pretty fair pace. The other problem with jumping is that it's totally unresponsive and unreliable. If you're moving with the keyboard, So I didn't point this out yet, but you can actually control your position in the world entirely with the mouse. As the mouse is placed within various portions of the 3D viewport, you'll see the cursor change to various symbols indicating what kind of movement will be performed if you press the left mouse button. This gets awkward pretty quickly though, so using the keyboard is ideal. But if you're using the keyboard both to move and to jump, more than half the time you attempt to jump, the jump key simply won't work, and I have no idea why. In fact, my testing shows it will work eventually, but you have to hit it like multiple times before it triggers, almost as though there's a certain window of time the jump key will work within. Now, this could be a bug related to the speed of the game. As you can see, this game can handle being run at 60 FPS without any other major issues, but back when this game came out, 60 FPS would have been virtually impossible to attain, not without turning all the detail levels down, so it's possible this jumping bug is related to the frame rate. But I ultimately discovered that it's only present if you both move and jump with the keyboard. If you move with the mouse and jump with the keyboard, it works 100% of the time. So anytime you have to make some jumps, switch to using the mouse for movement. Overall, this has been kind of a weird experience for me. As I've mentioned before, I never played any of the Ultima games growing up. Technically. See, the very first and only Ultima game I experienced as a kid, and only briefly, was Ultima 4, on a save file that was already well into it. Suffice to say, I had no idea what I was doing, and the notion of commanding a whole party in battles, which looked strategy-based, that kind of stuck with me. So as I developed my interest in gaming and realized how much I sucked at strategy games, I avoided the Ultima series because I remembered that one game which looked like it had strategy-based battles with lots of party members and how much I did not enjoy that. Going back and trying the original Ultima games again has proven to me that avoiding them all as a kid was a short-sighted decision, as they don't really play anything like my preconceptions made me expect. Heck, I loved playing Daggerfall, I loved playing System Shock, and Ultima Underworld is pretty much just an earlier incarnation of those games, and plays perfectly fine. Had I the time, I'd probably dig deeper into this to experience the whole thing, and then I may put it to a vote for my live streams in the future. But for now, it'll rest in my DOS gaming folder for when I have the time to sink into it. But the better question this game raised for me is, do I like this better than Arena? Or do I like Arena better? Well, that's a significantly harder question to answer. I think, ultimately, I prefer Arena, just because the mechanics in Arena are more familiar to me, and I'm a sucker for procedurally generated content. But Ultima Underworld is way better fleshed out due to its handcrafted nature. It's far less buggy, although it does have some serious game-breaking bugs I read about while researching this game, which don't have the potential to crop up until significantly later in. That's why I didn't encounter them. And quite frankly, the overall timing and frame rate work out far better. Ultima Underworld is actually playable at 60 FPS, whereas the speed of Arena's gameplay is directly tied into its frame rate, and since it was never intended to be played anywhere near 60 frames per second, it's quite the flail fest at that speed. So yeah, Ultima Underworld is absolutely worth checking out if you never have, and getting both Underworld games for $6 on GOG is definitely worth it if these kinds of action RPGs are your thing. However, for those of you who've tried to play this game more recently and ended up with problems, even with the GOG release, I have a solution for you. See, if there's one thing the people at Blue Sky and later Looking Glass Studios didn't know how to program properly, it was mouse support. The mouse cursor in this game is controlled entirely by Mickeys, and not by the actual hardware cursor position. Mickey being a term used in programming to refer to the actual amount of movement of the mouse as opposed to its cursor position. Now because of this, combined with some other factors, the cursor in this game, combined with DOSBox's default handling of the mouse, results in very jittery and poor performance. It was so bad, I almost bailed on DOSBox, opting for an Unreal Engine port of the game instead. But it turns out there was a solution, and it's really simple. Just double the normal mouse sensitivity to 200 in the DOSBox config file. Yeah, the mouse will be moving super fast when you do this, but you can then adjust the actual sensitivity of your mouse using whatever drivers or software you normally would, and you'll still have a proper functioning mouse in this game. I think what's actually going on is that this game is interpreting the Mickeys as being one less than they actually are. So if the mouse is reported as moving 3 pixels in one direction, the game thinks it only moved 2. 2 becomes 1, and 1 becomes 0, which would explain why the mouse tends to move easily in straight lines, but not diagonally when you use the default sensitivity setting of 100. Beyond that, just set cycles to max. The auto setting doesn't do the job, and it's not possible to get a fixed count high enough that both performs well and doesn't cause stuttering in the audio. And a quick reminder too that many modern video drivers have default profiles set up for DOSBox which may get reset whenever your drivers update, and that the max and auto settings do not work properly on the base version of DOSBox with vertical sync enabled. So make sure DOSBox is not being vertical synced under those conditions. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. And this is going to be an atypical month, as we're going to have a pro video next Saturday and 2 mod videos on the Saturdays following, to make up for not having a mod video in March. And first though is the next ADG Pro, where we're going to be going back to another game inspired by the Ultima series, to investigate how said game is calculating HP and MP for the player, since there isn't a clear indication as to how it's doing so. Not in the game nor in the manual, so be sure to stay tuned to see how that investigation plays out. Thanks for watching everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.